So the Department of Justice has asked the January 6th committee investigating the insurrection for the evidence it has developed courtesy of the testimony of 1,000 witnesses. This is an important development. Let's talk about it, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So the Department of Justice has asked the January 6th committee for their 1,000 transcripts of the witnesses who have testified about the insurrection. Now let's focus first and primarily on why this is good news, positive news, an important development on the justice front. Now I'm not going to ignore the downside or the concerns, but I will save them until the end of this video, because in this story, there is so much more light than darkness. Let's start with a new reporting from the New York Times. Headline: Justice Department is said to request transcripts from January 6th committee. And that article begins, the Justice Department has asked the House committee investigating the January 6th attack for transcripts of interviews it is conducting behind closed doors, including some with associates of former President Donald J. Trump. The move is further evidence of the wide-ranging nature of the department's criminal inquiry into the events leading up to the assault on the Capitol and the role played by Mr. Trump and his allies as they sought to keep him in office after his defeat in the 2020 election. More than 1,000 witnesses have testified behind closed doors to the J6 committee. For the next few minutes, I want to talk about the consequences of the J6 committee going first with these 1,000 witnesses and DOJ apparently going second. Okay, it's a little bit of a false construct because DOJ has been in the grand jury in some ways that we know, because they've been returning indictments and actually going to trial against insurrectionists, 800 of them, and they continue to work their way up the chain. They've been in the grand jury in a lot of ways we don't know and we're not supposed to know. But for purposes of this discussion, given where we are, let's assume J6 went first with these 1,000 witnesses, and DOJ will now go second once they get these 1,000 transcripts and follow up on them. And what consequences flow from that? Because there's a whole lot of good. This is kind of counterintuitive, but there's a whole lot of good that will come out of this. Here's how. First of all, because J6 went first with these 1,000 witnesses, we are going to get to see, starting on June 9th, the insurrection through the eyes and through the testimony of these 1,000 witnesses. Friends, that's important for our democracy. That's important for we the people, starting on June 9, to see what Donald Trump and company did through the eyes and the testimony of the people who lived it, those 1,000 witnesses. If the Department of Justice had gone first with those 1,000 witnesses, we wouldn't be hearing about it. Not on June 9 or June 10, not in 2022, not in 2023, maybe not even in 2024. Why? Because we'd be bound by the grand jury rules of secrecy. Government couldn't breathe a word of what those 1,000 witnesses said in the grand jury. In fact, we might never know what they said unless and until defendants were indicted, public trials were held, and those witnesses, whatever small batch of the 1,000 the prosecutors decided to put on the stand at public trials, would we know anything about what they said? And that would take place well off into the future. That is a significant benefit of J6 going first with these 1,000 witnesses, and then the Department of Justice taking those 1,000 transcripts and following up. Here's another significant benefit. The 1,000 witnesses that testified to the J6 committee, many of them would not have testified in the grand jury at all. Why do I say that? When we are investigating a case in the grand jury, if we have witnesses that have any criminal exposure, then we have to decide whether those people, those witnesses, are either targets of the investigation or subjects of the investigation. Please stick with me here, friends. I don't want to make this a Crim Law 101 class, but let me work through some of these issues. If somebody has some criminal exposure, then they're going to end up being at least a subject of the grand jury investigation. What are the consequences of that? Before I can put somebody before the grand jury and compel them to testify, because a grand jury subpoena compels them to testify, I have to advise them of their rights, either their subject rights or their target rights, and they're slightly different, but they involve a warning, an admonition that you don't have to testify. If you have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, well then because you're a subject in this grand jury investigation or a target of the grand jury investigation, you don't have to testify. You can invoke your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and you can walk out that door. A grand jury appearance has a way of focusing a witness's mind and priorities and concern. And they get lawyers, and those lawyers say, you will not testify. If you're a subject or a target, you will invoke your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Stick with me on this. One more minute, friends. This is so good. If a witness pleads the Fifth in the grand jury, well, grand jury secrecy rules apply and we can't tell anybody about it. If a witness pleads the Fifth in front of the J6 committee, we all hear about it. We heard about Roger Stone pleading the Fifth. And that's good to know because that tells us he has criminal exposure. It tells us if he had decided to testify truthfully before the grand jury, he would have, before the J6 committee, he would have incriminated himself. So there is actually more evidence that was developed in the J6 committee hearing from witnesses who might be subjects, who might have some criminal exposure, but they were willing to testify because the J6 committee doesn't have to instruct them, advise them, warn them of their subject or target warnings and tell them they don't have to testify. They may know that, but the atmosphere in a congressional committee hearing versus in the grand jury and the consequences that flow from those different atmospheres and concerns are very different. So more people would have been shut down, wouldn't have testified at all because they would have invoked their Fifth in the grand jury. Not so in a J6 committee hearing, for practical reasons as much as for legal reasons. So more evidence was developed, but this next piece is even more important, friends. More incriminating information was developed because the J6 committee went first. Here's how. Steve Bannon, Mark Meadows, Peter Navarro, Dan Scavino are all in contempt of Congress, and they've all been referred for prosecution. What does that prove? It proves that these four men, air quotes, were willing to commit the crime of contempt of Congress rather than testify and incriminate Donald Trump. That evidence would not have been developed if these men had been subpoenaed to the grand jury, because I can promise you they would have pled the Fifth, and this incriminating evidence against them would never exist. But because they were willing to commit the crime of contempt of Congress rather than testify and incriminate Donald Trump is powerful, powerful evidence that these four men are part of Donald Trump's conspiracy. They were part of it when Donald Trump was trying to criminally overturn the election's results, and they remain part of his conspiracy to this day. That's evidence, incriminating evidence, important evidence, evidence that will be used by the Department of Justice to break those witnesses. And when I say break, I mean to get the truth out of them and bring them on board as cooperating witnesses against Donald Trump and others. And that evidence would not have been developed. It wouldn't exist if J6 hadn't gone first. One more piece of why it's a good thing that J6 went first and DOJ is going second. Folks like Don Jr. never would have testified. Don Jr., if he was given a grand jury subpoena, any lawyer worth his or her salt would absolutely have said, hey, little Donnie, look at your texts saying that your dad's second term must start today even before the election results are in. Boy, that was deeply treasonous in the practical sense, in the lay sense of the word treason. Oh, and by the way, little Donnie, you spoke at the pre-insurrection pep rally on January 6th and among other things led the angry mob in chants of fight for Trump. You have a right against self-incrimination all day long. You will plead the fifth in the grand jury. Not so in front of J6. Remember little Donnie went in there and bluffed and blustered and probably lied. Would anybody bet $1 that Donald Trump Jr. told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to the J6 committee? Would anybody bet $1 million that he lied? Come on now. Of course he lied. It's who he is. And all of that incriminating information that was developed through and against Don Jr. came courtesy of the J6 committee going first. That incriminating evidence would not have existed if the Department of Justice had gone first with these 1,000 witnesses. And there are so many more benefits to the fact that DOJ will now have 1,000 transcripts of sworn testimony that, friends, trust me, those transcripts can be given to the grand jury. Hearsay is admissible in a grand jury investigation. And then what I assume the Department of Justice will do is they will pick and choose which transcripts to present to the grand jury, which witnesses to follow up with because they've provided important information under oath to the J6 committee, and now DOJ may have further questions, may want to further develop that evidence. You know, I don't know if this was part of the plan from jump. I don't know if it was in part happenstance, but I do know there is so much light, more light than darkness, because J6 went first with those 1,000 witnesses. Unorthodox though that may have been, more light than darkness. Okay, now as promised, let's talk about the downside, the concerns that are conjured up by a congressional committee, the January 6th committee, going first with the witnesses and DOJ going second. I can tell you, friends, from my career as a federal prosecutor, we always want first crack at a witness. Why is that? Well, if I know I'm going to have to present the testimony of this witness in a future criminal prosecution, then I want to be the first one to interview that witness about what he or she knows. I want to be the first one to be in a position to place that witness under oath and lock in for posterity that witness's testimony. Because I have a responsibility to develop that testimony truthfully, accurately, fully, and as close in time to the events that that witness has knowledge of, experienced, so the witness's memory is as fresh as possible. So I want to be the first one to capture that sworn testimony and preserve it for use at a future criminal trial. If other organizations, other governmental agencies, other jurisdictions get first crack at that witness, that can present problems for the federal prosecution. When I was a federal prosecutor in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, it wasn't unusual for other agencies or other jurisdictions to, at times, have an interest in what the witness in my case saw or knew. Sometimes it was Congress had an interest. Sometimes it was the DC city government had an interest in what my witness knew. When I say my, not in the possessive way, but a witness that I was going to be using in a future prosecution. Sometimes the state of Maryland had an interest because there was some joint investigation or there were crimes that were committed in multiple jurisdictions. Sometimes it was the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I always wanted to get first crack at the witness, to lock in the witness's truthful, accurate account. And then if the witness had to be made available to other jurisdictions or other governmental agencies because they had interests as well, well, then that would happen. So this is unusual. It's unusual for DOJ to apparently take a back seat to Congress or any other agency, organization, or jurisdiction that wants to deal with a witness who might have to testify in a future prosecution. But I've said all along, friends, we do have this usual investigative blueprint that we follow. But there's nothing usual about the crimes that Donald Trump and his criminal associates committed against our democracy. So maybe the unusual, unprecedented nature of a president and his co-conspirators in and out of government trying to overthrow the government, trying to invalidate a free and fair presidential election, maybe that is so unusual and unprecedented that DOJ needed to take an unusual and perhaps unprecedented investigative approach to this case. And that seems to be what they've done. Doesn't mean it's going to turn out to be perfect, doesn't mean it's going to turn out to be horrible, but I can see the tactical upside of why things have proceeded the way they have. Another downside of DOJ waiting to go second, if that's in fact what they did, it's taken too darn long. That's my main beef. Donald Trump and his criminal associates have been out there footloose and fancy-free, ginning up more division, arguably recruiting a new batch of insurrectionists should they need to attack our democracy again in the future. And it's taken too darn long to hold them accountable. But here's the thing. This investigation was going to take a long time one way or another. And if that is the case, then you might as well do it in the most tactically shrewd and savvy way possible, even if it is an unconventional investigative approach. So there are definitely some concerns. There's definitely some downside because DOJ will now take these 1,000 transcripts. They may look at some and say, oof, looks like this witness actually lied before the J6 committee. Okay, well, you know what? Witnesses lie to prosecutors and to the grand jury all the time, and we have to clean it up. We have to find ways to call their lies, often with their own statements and emails and text messages and direct messages and statements to others and social media posts, etc. And then we have to clean them up in the grand jury anyway, confront them and get the full truth out of them. Maybe we charge them with perjury for their original lies, maybe we don't. But cleaning up the testimony of a witness is not an unusual necessity for prosecutors. So they may have to clean up some of the transcripts if witnesses lied before the grand jury. When I say clean up the transcripts, I'm using shorthand for confront the witness, break them, expose the lies, and get them to tell the truth. And then move forward with that witness and perhaps put them back in front of the grand jury for some more sworn testimony. All of that is par for the prosecutorial course. We do that kind of stuff all the time. So any of the concerns, any of the downside that is a product of J6 going first and DOJ going second can be dealt with. But let me leave you with this, friends, because we're going to come back to the lightness. We are going to see, beginning on June 6th, dramatic testimony through the eyes of the witnesses who were there. You want to talk about the people in the room at the time, that Donald Trump was plotting and planning and scheming to overthrow our democracy and reinstall himself in the Oval Office unconstitutionally? We're going to see it through the eyes of the people who were there and who can expose the crimes of Trump and company. And once we see that, friends, in public hearings beginning on June 6th, and once we know there is ample evidence to prove those crimes, the Department of Justice cannot decline to indict the men and women responsible for the insurrection. Not after we've seen that evidence. And we never would have seen that evidence had DOJ gone first with those 1,000 witnesses and J6 gone second. But once we see it, and as Representative Raskin and others have been telling us, have been promising us, it's going to knock the constitutional wind right out of us. It's going to blow the roof off the House. Once we see it, DOJ must indict. They must prosecute. Because if they don't, then they bring our democracy to a grinding halt, and they completely undermine any confidence that the American people have in our institutions, in our Department of Justice, in our law enforcement authorities. DOJ must indict after the evidence is exposed to we the people. Because justice matters. Folks, that was a very long video. I appreciate you sticking with me. If you have stuck with me this long, I will tell you that, as you may know, the work we do here at Justice Matters is an all-volunteer effort, creating these videos and posting them 7 days a week, every day of the year, trying to analyze what's going on inside our federal government, trying to fight for accountability, trying to fight for justice. If you would like to become a more formal supporter of our all-volunteer efforts and our mission and our content, please feel free to come over to patreon.com. You can sign up to become a patron, and if you do, I'll send you some Team Justice and Justice Matters stickers and a personal handwritten note of thanks. Plus, you'll get a look at all sorts of behind-the-scenes stuff about how we operate, and you'll get more information about the democracy projects that we are working on at Justice Matters. And thank you to all of you who are supporting our efforts over on Patreon and elsewhere. Friends, as always, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. Things are heading in the right direction. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.